Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Willow found herself standing at the edge of a precipice where every choice she made could alter not only her own destiny but also the lives of her children and everyone bound to them. For a fleeting moment, she believed she had escaped the whirlpool of manipulation and deceit that once consumed her. Yet just as quickly as she thought she was free, Drew pulled her back into his carefully woven net. At first, it seemed innocent, the warmth of his embrace, the late-night phone calls filled with tender promises, and the illusion of stability he offered. To Willow, who had endured so much loss and longing, those gestures felt like a lifeline. But behind the soothing words and feigned sacrifices lay something darker, a labyrinth of schemes where Drew had no hesitation in using any weapon at his disposal to bend the world to his will. What Willow failed to see in the beginning was how meticulously Drew had designed his plan. He knew with frightening precision how deeply Willow ached to hold Wiley and Amelia again. He understood the unbearable weight of a mother's separation from her children, and he was more than willing to weaponize that love. By relinquishing Scout into Alexis' care, Drew staged a performance of selflessness. To Willow, it looked like the ultimate sacrifice, a man giving up his own daughter's presence in his home to ensure stability and a brighter future. But that carefully crafted image was nothing more than a mask. Beneath it, Drew was orchestrating the next act in his plot, plotting with attorneys behind closed doors, crafting false narratives, and even considering fabricated evidence to destroy Michael's credibility in court. The logic was simple in Drew's mind: once Michael was discredited, Willow would see him as powerless, unworthy of her trust. And with Michael out of the way, Drew would stand tall as the sole protector, the man who could restore her life, her children, and her sense of family. It was manipulation painted as devotion, and Willow, driven by desperation and blinded by hope, allowed herself to believe. In her vulnerability, Willow accepted Drew's reasoning. She saw sacrifice where there was calculation, compassion where there was cunning. Each gesture of his appeared to her as proof of his unwavering loyalty, when in truth, it was part of an elaborate strategy to trap her further. Love, or what she thought was love, dulled her ability to discern the sharp edges beneath his words. Drew positioned himself as the bridge connecting her back to her children, and Willow, clinging to that bridge, never stopped to wonder what it was built upon. She imagined herself reunited with Wiley and Amelia, living again as the mother she was meant to be, and in that vision Drew was the architect of her salvation. She did not see that the foundation beneath her was rotting, riddled with deception and betrayal. As days passed, the illusion deepened. Each time Willow leaned on Drew for comfort, she sank further into his world of shadows. She told herself this was the path she had to take, that Drew's sacrifices and schemes were necessary evils in a battle stacked against her. She silenced the nagging doubts in her chest, ignored the warnings of those around her, and convinced herself that Drew's love was the anchor she needed. But in reality, she was no longer the author of her choices. She had become a piece in his game, a pawn moved across the board at his will, her hopes and her pain fueling his strategy. Yet destiny has a way of unraveling lies at the most unexpected moments, and Drew's fortress of deception would not remain impenetrable forever. The storm that Scout unleashed with her innocent words continued to reverberate inside Willow long after that moment had passed. It was as though a veil had been ripped away, and the world she thought she knew collapsed around her, leaving behind a landscape of broken trust and bitter clarity. The quiet strength of a child's observation carried more weight than the pleas and warnings of all the adults who had tried to reach her. Elizabeth's dismay, Rick's stern cautions, Nina's sly suspicions, all of them had failed to move her. But hearing Scout describe Drew's betrayal without malice, without calculation, simply as truth, pierced through every defense Willow had built. At first, Willow tried to deny it to herself. She told herself that perhaps Scout had misunderstood, that maybe Drew's meetings with Alexis were about something else, that the papers hidden away were for a different matter entirely. She clung to the possibility that Drew's threats against Michael were simply outbursts of frustration, nothing more. But the more she tried to convince herself, the louder Scout's voice echoed in her memory. Children did not invent such details. Scout had seen what she claimed to have seen, heard what she said she heard. And Willow realized that the child had no reason to fabricate lies about her own father. This left Willow facing a truth so sharp and unrelenting that it nearly shattered her. Drew had not only deceived her, but he had also exploited his daughter's life as if it were a bargaining chip on a chessboard. He had twisted love into leverage, turned family into a weapon, and manipulated Willow's most desperate desire, her longing to be reunited with Wiley and Amelia. Suddenly, every moment with Drew played back in her mind like a film. The long embraces that once seemed so warm now felt suffocating. The whispered promises that had soothed her soul now rang with menace. The sacrifices she had praised him for were nothing but tools in his arsenal of manipulation. The days that followed became a relentless cycle of inner conflict. By day, Willow carried on, trying to maintain composure, but inside she was unraveling. At night, when silence closed in, she was consumed by questions that refused to leave her alone. How could she have been so blind? How could she have ignored every red flag in her hunger for love and security? How could she, a mother fighting to reclaim her children, allow herself to fall under the control of a man who would sell out his own blood? These questions tore at her, each one a reminder of how far she had strayed from her own values. The weight of guilt pressed heavily on Willow's chest. She thought of Wiley and Amelia constantly, remembering the moments she had been forced to leave them behind, the tears she shed in silence when she longed for their embrace. Everything she had done, every compromise, every concession, had been for them. But now she realized she had endangered them instead. By tethering herself to Drew, she had risked tying their futures to a man consumed by ambition and deceit. The very dream she had pursued with him, regaining her children, was the same dream that he had poisoned with his manipulation. Scout's revelations also changed the way Willow looked at the child. She had always felt a quiet bond with Scout, but now that bond grew into something far deeper. This little girl had been forced into a role she never asked for, carrying knowledge that no child should bear. The thought of Drew using Scout, of turning her into a pawn, filled Willow with both sorrow and fury. It awakened a protective instinct she hadn't felt before, one that went beyond her bond with Wiley and Amelia. She could not allow Drew to destroy Scout's innocence in the pursuit of his schemes. Gradually, Willow's sorrow began to harden into resolve. She knew she had been manipulated, but she refused to remain a victim. She could not undo the mistakes of the past weeks, but she could choose differently now. The path forward would be fraught with obstacles. Drew would not release her easily, and his fury at losing control would make him dangerous. Michael might still doubt her intentions after everything she had done under Drew's influence. The courts would not automatically grant her the rights she yearned for. But Willow began to see that the only way to reclaim her children and her life was to break free completely from Drew's grasp. Her nights were sleepless, filled with visions of future battles. She pictured Drew confronting her in rage, his voice rising, his threats aimed not just at Michael but at her as well. She imagined the courtroom, where every secret could be exposed, and where Drew would fight tooth and nail to paint himself as the hero while casting her as weak and unreliable. She imagined facing Michael, who had every reason to distrust her now, and pleading with him to see that she had been deceived, that she was ready to fight for her children with honesty this time. These visions terrified her, but they also steeled her resolve. Willow's greatest fear was that Drew would strike first, using the information and influence he already possessed to isolate her further. She knew his pattern now: he would threaten, he would manipulate, and he would turn anyone he could into a pawn. But she also realized that the truth was her strongest weapon. What Scout had revealed to her could no longer be silenced. If she remained complicit, Drew would win. If she spoke, if she exposed his schemes, she could shatter his control. But speaking out would also mean turning against the man she had once loved, standing against him in a way that would unleash all of his wrath. For days, Willow walked around with that choice heavy in her heart. Each glance at Scout reminded her of what was at stake. Each memory of Wiley and Amelia reminded her of why she could no longer falter. And slowly, the woman who had been blinded by love began to transform into a mother fueled by determination. She understood now that true love for her children meant rejecting every false promise Drew had offered. It meant facing him as an enemy, not a partner. It meant stepping into the storm, prepared to weather the backlash, because the future of her children depended on it. By the end of that week, Willow's path had become clear. She would no longer hide behind Drew's shadow. She would stand on her own, even if it meant walking into the fire. And in that decision lay both her greatest risk and her greatest strength, the choice to fight not with deceit, but with truth, no matter how much it cost her. The reckoning was coming, and when it did, Willow vowed she would no longer be a pawn. She would be the one to turn the tide. Drew's descent began as a slow slide and turned into a headlong plunge the moment he sensed Willow slipping from his orbit. Control had always been the quiet engine beneath his polished restraint. Losing it stripped away the veneer that once made him seem dependable. He sharpened his posture in public, tightened his messaging, and cultivated a narrative in private that cast Michael as reckless and unfit. Motions appeared overnight bearing the stamp of urgency, investigators surfaced with dossiers that seemed prepared in advance, sympathetic contacts whispered to court reporters about a father guided by principle and a rival guided by jealousy. Every move was designed to corner Michael and, by extension, box Willow into choosing the path Drew insisted was inevitable. The more he pressed, the more obvious the fault lines became, and the image he had so carefully curated began to crack under the strain of his own aggression. The campaign spilled beyond the courthouse corridors. Financial records, selectively framed, were teased to opinion writers eager for a headline. A clip clipped of a confrontation at a charity event circulated bereft of context, its edges shaved to flatter Drew's case. Subpoenas piled up in stacks meant as much to intimidate as to gather facts. A private investigator trawled the Quartermain stables and the family's old digital backups, looking for fodder that could be spliced into a story of moral superiority. To anyone who did not know better, it was the march of a disciplined strategist. To Willow, now alert to the tremor beneath the surface, it was the heavy-footed choreography of a man who measured love in victories and children in leverage. What Drew failed to anticipate was the alchemy of confrontation and clarity. His escalation, meant to force compliance, created the contrast Willow needed to see him without the softening lens of longing. Each legal threat carved away what remained of the persona he had tried to sell her. The benevolent protector, the sacrificial partner, the steadfast father. In its place stood ambition without guardrails, a willingness to bend people into instruments, and a chilling comfort with the idea that an outcome justified any method. The more he tried to humiliate Michael, the more Willow understood that humiliation itself had become Drew's preferred method of control. That shift in perception did not make Willow's path simple, it made it honest. There were practical fears, the cold weight of a courtroom, the possibility of losing ground with a single misstep, the knowledge that Michael's hurt still ran deep, and the reality that Elizabeth's caution, Rick's legal instincts, and Nina's maneuvering would collide in ways that would not always favor her. Yet beneath the anxiety, a steadier current gathered. Willow recognized that affection severed from integrity was not a bridge back to her children but a tether to someone else's agenda. She began to peel her life back from Drew's framework, one deliberate decision at a time, not with grand pronouncements but with quiet, irreversible acts. She started by opening everything to the light. She built a timeline with care, sifting through texts, calendar entries, and emails that once felt like private lifelines and now read like a ledger of control. She logged the night Scout described a locked drawer and the mornings that followed when Drew seemed nervy yet triumphant. She added the dates of whispered meetings, the filing times on surprise motions, the transfer of a retainer to a shadowy investigator whose address resembled a mail drop more than an office. She separated fact from inference, then attached receipts where she could find them. She did not rush. She did not dramatize. She documented. Because Scout should never have been placed at the center of an adult war, Willow refused to make the child a spectacle. She reached out to a child advocate and to a therapist who specialized in family systems, requesting a protective route for any information the court needed to hear. The goal was not to thrust a child onto the witness list, but to ensure the court understood the ecosystem that had formed around that child, the bargains proposed about her living arrangement, the emotional weather pattern created by those bargains, and the ways those forces affected judgment. Willow wanted the judge to absorb not just the cold lines of a filing, but the texture of a life shaped by leverage. With the framework in place, she turned to the living web of relationships that would decide how hard the road would be. Michael remained a knot of anger and caution. Willow did not ask him for absolution. She asked only for time to let actions accrue where words had once failed. She knew Elizabeth's compassion was balanced by clinical realism and that Rick's antennae for manipulation were finely tuned. She took their reservations as a compass, not an indictment. Nina's unpredictability formed a separate calculus altogether, one Willow accounted for by assuming turbulence and planning for it rather than attempting to neutralize it. This was not a campaign for allies through persuasion, it was an invitation to observers to watch her be different, consistently, until disbelief softened into trust. The pivot came when Drew signaled that pressure alone would not suffice and began repackaging pressure as inevitability. He filed for expedited hearings and attached memoranda laced with insinuation, as if repetition could turn accusation into axiom. The filing stylized Willow's recent choices as instability while painting his transfer of Scout's day-to-day care to Alexis as noble restraint. In the sterile cadence of legal prose, love and leverage became indistinguishable, unless someone took the stand, figuratively and literally, to separate them again. Willow chose to be that someone. Her declaration read like a map back to herself. It did not trade in spectacle, and it did not return fire with fire. It detailed points of contact, patterns of pressure, and the sequence that transformed longing into acquiescence. It explained her course correction without excusing her complicity, admitting the hunger that had made her vulnerable and the steps she had taken to repair the harm of that vulnerability. It insisted upon the dignity of each child touched by the case and the difference between paternal love and paternal strategy. It asked for oversight, not indulgence, structure, not chaos, time with her children earned through accountability, not shortcuts purchased through intimidation. Drew's counterpunch was swift and glossy, a stack of exhibits curated to imply more than they proved. Yet the energy of the room, inside chambers, inside the courtroom, inside the conversations that thread around the lives in Port Charles, changed perceptibly. The very acceleration he had chosen began to look like haste. The optics of strength began to look like overreach. The transactional framing of his decision about Scout, which he had hoped would read as sacrifice, now read as a negotiation conducted with a child's daily life. Where he saw checkmate, others began to see a board overturned to avoid playing by rules he could not bend. In that opening, Willow found her center. She set boundaries that had never existed in her orbit with Drew. She refused late-night strategy sessions framed as urgency. She declined to sign addenda crafted to tie her hands to his litigation posture. She insisted, through counsel, that all communication flow through formal channels designed to protect minors and to prevent the casual escalation of conflict. She carved out mornings devoted solely to restorative routines, appointments, supervised connections where appropriate, therapy sessions that refused to flatten her grief into slogans. She approached each day less as a performance for the court and more as the work of rebuilding the habits that would sustain her children's sense of safety. The court dates arrived with the regularity of tides, each bringing its own undertow. Drew tried to collapse everything into a single narrative arc, competence versus chaos, rectitude versus regret. Willow declined the false binary. Her filing separated issues instead of conflating them, time with children as a present-tense question of welfare, long-term custody as a future-tense question of capacity, past misjudgments as a matter for remediation rather than perpetual branding. She accepted oversight while rejecting control, a posture that made no headline and won no immediate victories but accumulated credibility in ways a blitz could not. Outside the courtroom, the human work continued. She met with school counselors about the rhythms that helped Wiley regulate his day and the signals that soothed Amelia when transitions overwhelmed her. She spoke with pediatricians about routines that stabilized sleep and with a child psychologist about ways to narrate complicated adult shifts without burdening young minds. She drew small circles of normalcy and defended them with the same ferocity others brought to motions and memos. She did this not to create optics but to build muscle memory, hers and her children's, so that stability did not feel like a performance but like a home. Drew recognized the shift and, in recognizing it, pressed harder. He widened the aperture of his discovery demands, sought to subpoena friends who had nothing to offer but were easy to scare, and flirted with the outer edge of propriety in his dealings with the press. Each new push produced a diminishing return.